I did say yesterday, I think, that when you talk about evolution versus religion or religions or particular religious books or positions, it's important to define exactly what are the materials in the discussion. And I said that if your project is to reconcile evolution with the first chapter of Genesis, that's one project. And if it's to reconcile evolution with the entirety of the Jewish tradition, it's a different project. And evolution, the way it's defined, is certainly not going to be compatible with the Jewish religion as an entire system. Then I started to talk about reconciling evolution with the evidence. And then the question is whether, number one, the evidence supports evolution, and then even possibly maybe the evidence contradicts evolution. And I think that when we get finished, it certainly will not be all right to believe in evolution, not on the basis of the evidence, and certainly not on the basis of the Jewish tradition. The idea that God used evolution to be able to create the life is certainly possible, but not everything that's possible is true. Talk to conspiracy theorists about that. So I think it's inappropriate to believe in evolution. Again, as I said once, and I'm going to repeat over and over again because this is always misconstrued to the benefit of the critic, not because I say that I can prove that it's false, but there's absolutely no justification for believing it's true. And there is an alternative, and that's just to admit ignorance, isn't there? You don't have to take a position, do you? Okay. So now yesterday what we talked about was the fact that, well, first of all, I described evolution, which is the standard description. There are things that make copies of themselves. Those things are subject to undirected, uncontrolled, unmanaged, and therefore sometimes called random, in quotes, put it in quotes because nobody can define it, random forces that break them, change them, manipulate them. And then there are changes in these things that replicate themselves, and sometimes the changes create improvements in self-replication, and that's just a competition between the original ones that are still making copies and the new ones that are making better copies, until the new ones undergo some accidental change which makes even newer ones that are even better, and then you got three, and then there's competition, and they drive each other out because of lack of resources, and that's the whole story. From that comes the whole envelope of life. That's the story. And the question is whether there is adequate reason to believe it. Because I'm putting the burden of proof on the believer. I'm asking him to justify believing in it. My job is just to see whether he can present adequate reason to believe it. My job is not to show that it's false. My job is to investigate whether he has succeeded in presenting adequate reason to believe it. And I think that's wrong in spades. And I pointed out that in the actual formulation of the theory, the information that it gives you, there's a crucial missing piece without which the theory doesn't say enough for you to be able to make up your mind whether or not to believe it. It's not a candidate for judgment because it leaves out a crucial piece. If someone claims that a certain circumstance was brought about by a process that's unguided, unmanaged, uncontrolled, unfocused, that is to say, by accident or random, in order for me to make up my mind whether I should believe it or not, I need to have some estimate of the probability that the process that he thinks brought it about. Because he's only appealing to this process as something which unguided, uncontrolled, unfocused, made it happen. Well, the only way I can make up my mind whether this so-called random process did it is to know what is the probability that that random process would bring it about. If he doesn't tell me what the probability is, I can't make up my mind. My example was, you have an object which on one side, an X has been painted, and someone tells you he threw it into the air 3 times and it landed on the X 3 times in a row. in an unguided, uncontrolled, unfocused, unmanaged process, and he asks you to believe him, and I queried whether you could make up your mind to believe him or not, and almost everybody said yes. And then I point out that I left out one crucial piece of information. I didn't tell you how many sides the object has, how many faces, because it's a three-dimensional object. I didn't tell you how many it has. You assumed it was a coin, the probability is 1 in 8. That's quite reasonable to believe. If it's a shiliagan with 1,000 sides, then the probability of getting 3 of them in a row is 1 in a billion. That's quite unreasonable. Now, suppose I don't tell you what the object is. I don't know how many faces it has. Then your response should be, well, I haven't got enough information to make up my mind whether to believe you that this unguided, uncontrolled, unfocused process caused the object to land on the X 3 times in a row, just randomly. You haven't given me enough information. I can't make up my mind until I know what the probability is. And then I pointed out that it is impossible for the story of the evolution of life over the last 4.3 billion years to give us any kind of estimate of the probability of its happening due to that process, because to do that, you'd have to know a list of all the mutations that took place during that period of time, of which there are hundreds of thousands or millions, and each one took place in a particular environment, particular physical circumstances, which would create a particular probability of that mutation taking place. You'd have to have all that information and multiply to find out the probability of them all taking place. And no one's dreaming about getting that kind of information. So it's just not there. And if it's not there, then making up my mind whether this random process produced this result is just not reasonable. That's a very simple, direct, logical challenge to the claim that there is reason to accept evolution as true. For the 16th time, this is not a consideration that's supposed to convince you it's false. It's just supposed to convince you that there isn't adequate reason to believe that it's true. And therefore you should just confess ignorance and say, maybe it's false, maybe it's true, but I don't know, and there's no reason to make up my mind. That was the key argument from yesterday. Are we together with that? Or any questions about that? Any ideas arose about that? Okay, no. Then I told you that the evolutionist will claim that there's a book of life. This I took from Alvin Plantinga. And the book of life is this list of all the mutations with in the particular environment, physical environment that they took place with the probabilities from beginning to end. And of course, we don't have that, and we can't get that. So then I played out a little dialogue with the evolutionist who says, well, we don't have it, and you can't get it, but it's certainly possible. And since it's possible, and it is conservative, it doesn't evoke the features of the world we don't know and don't have no reason to accept or not adequate reason to accept. So you should accept it because since it's possible and it's the most familiar and the most conservative, that's the right thing to believe unless other information comes into existence. So I said, well, how do you know it's possible? Physically possible. There have been many things in the history of the world which have been thought to be physically possible and turned out not to be physically possible by great people like Newton, who thought that light travels instantaneously. That turns out to be impossible. So how do you know this is possible? So, of course, he can't tell me that no new discoveries might arise that might show that it's impossible. So he has to back off that claim. No, it's not really that I know it's possible, but everything we know doesn't contradict it. We don't know it to be impossible. So I said, well, really? Everything you know doesn't contradict it? How do you know that? Do you know all the logical implications of everything you know? You don't, because there's an infinity of them, and you can't represent them mechanically because there's no possible machine that can deliver them. That was Gödel's incompleteness theorem as applied to decision theory. So you can't know the implications of what you know. So you can't say, all of what I know doesn't rule it out. Maybe it does rule it out. You haven't figured that out yet. You haven't discovered that yet. So then he's reduced to, well, I don't know of anything of the things I know that rules it out. I'm not aware of something that I know that rules it out. Well, congratulations. Of course you're not, because otherwise you wouldn't accept it. But is that a good reason to accept a proposition? Because you're not aware of anything you know that rules it out? Therefore I should believe it's true? Surely that's not a recommendation for accepting something is true. Just imagine that a murder is committed and there are 3 suspects. And the police department says, look, well, there are 3 suspects and we want to solve the murder. We've got to investigate all of them. Okay, you're investigating all of them because nothing you know you're aware of that rules out any of them. That's why you're investigating them. So now if nothing I know, I'm not aware of anything I know that rules it out, means I should believe it's true, then I should believe that all 3 of them did it. Because nothing I know, I'm not aware of anything I know that rules out any of them. Surely that's wrong. You can't promote acceptance that Q is true on the grounds that I'm not aware of anything that I know that rules it out. There might be something I know that rules it out, but I'm not aware of it. And certainly it might be physically impossible, I don't know that either. That's not a recommendation for believing it. So here again, the person is plumping for, you've got to accept it because it's been shown to be true, has no leg to stand on. That was the second thing I said yesterday. Okay? Now the last thing I was asked yesterday, and I answered it, but I want to just elaborate a little bit on it, and that was the fossil record. Doesn't the fossil record give you a complete enough picture for you to see what happened over the centuries and millennia and millions of years? Now, I gave an answer yesterday. I just want to elaborate a little bit. Ernst Mayr was a professor at Harvard, strong believer in evolution, one of the most intelligent, fair-minded defenders of evolution, wrote an article in which he pointed out that historically the word evolution has at least 5 different meanings. So when you have a discussion about evolution, it might be a good idea to find what you mean. I did that, but let me give you the 5 of them and then point out that I'm only talking about one of them. One meaning of evolution that has been used over and over again is things have changed, period. Things aren't always the same. There have been changes in the biota, the living creatures on the Earth's surface. You have the tusks of the woolly the ancestors of the elephants, long tusks. You have bones of creatures that are much bigger. Things have changed. Almost everybody's convinced of that. Even from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, there have been changes that we can document. So things haven't remained constant. Everybody agrees to that. And there was a 19th century German naturalist who said, evolution, the truth of evolution is as obvious as the fact that the Earth goes around the sun. That's what he meant. Just that things have changed. Another meaning for evolution is common descent. There was a single thing that became a self-replicator, and then it replicated, and the process that I described to you, to accidents in its replication, leading to changes, most of which cause it to disintegrate and die, and some of which improve it. And from that first thing that started to replicate, everything else is derived. And it's derived by these slow, gradual changes and slow differences that accumulate into making the variety of life that we see. That's the second meaning. The third meaning is a certain process by which new species evolve. What did Darwin call the name of his book?
Origin of Species.
Yeah, you see, he's old enough to know. The rest of you have been trained in a world which despises important information. Origin of species. Well, evolution is supposed to explain, particularly, was the coming into existence of new species. That's another meaning of the word evolution. Then there's the meaning of the word evolution that I'm talking about. I'm trying to think of what the fifth one was. That is that there's a way in which organisms change there's a cause that makes them change. This is explaining how and why they change. And that is random changes plus selection. Now you look at the fossil record, which one of these meanings of evolution does the fossil record support? Well, it clearly supports that there's been change, because you find bones of a type that we don't have anymore. Right? Does the fossil record support the idea that the engine of change, the cause of change, the explanation of change is random variation and selection? Not really. How? The idea of random selection and variation is to explain the fossil record. You have to ask whether it's a good explanation or a bad explanation. You have to ask whether there are competing explanations. You have to ask whether the explanation can actually fit the data. The mere fact of the fossil record doesn't do that. So we are talking only about the hypothesis that random selection and random change in selection is what explains, what causes and explains how life developed. That's all we're talking about, not any of the other meanings of evolution. Now, one of the meanings of evolution, which is related, is the idea of common descent. This process of random change and selection is supposed to have started from a single thing that made copies of itself and then caused an accumulation of changes which spread out into the envelope of life. That gets you what Darwin called the tree of life. The ultimate root of the tree is this single thing that makes copies, and then as it develops and changes accumulate, you have branches that use these differences, branches that use those differences, branches subdivide, and you get a tree of life. Each thing is in a linear path going back to the ultimate thing that started the chain. I suppose this is still in the science museums, and it's still in the textbooks. What they won't tell you is that there are at least 3 giant problems with this idea of the tree of life. And you can Google it. It's not hidden in some religious monastery someplace. There are critics, but they won't tell you about it. One thing is that you have different trees of life, not one. First of all, you have the fossil record, which gives you at least a rough order in which these organisms come into existence. And then, now that we have molecular biology, we can trace the development of molecules over time. And you can talk about how long it takes a certain molecule to change to a certain degree, and you compare the molecules that you find in fossils versus the molecules that we find today, and the other molecules that we can compare them with. You can build a picture of how this molecule evolved into that molecule and that molecule and that molecule. And you can build a tree of life on the basis of the evolution of the molecules. There's only one problem. The tree of life based on the fossils, the tree of life based on the molecules isn't the same. They don't show the same lineages. They don't show the same development relationships. Not only that, but there's more than one molecule to trace. And if you trace different molecules, you get different trees. So there are problems in the wilderness here. You believe in the tree, but your evidence doesn't give you a consistent picture of what the tree looks like. Much worse than that, the last 10 years, 15 years, they have been working on a new discovery, LTG. Yeah, that's what it's called, LTG. LGT, lateral gene transfer. Genes transfer from organism to organism, not just down the DNA path. Genes can be shared and transferred, not only with bacteria, but with whole animals they can be transferred. And nobody knows how far it goes. No, you can't have a tree if sometimes in the middle of the tree, genes are transferred horizontally. They go from branch to branch. That branch doesn't become a sub-branch of this branch, but on the other hand, it's not distinct for this branch. You don't have branches. They're discovering more LGT all the time. So this naive idea that there's a well-known branching system, and it's all based on changes in the DNA, and the tree of life today is in tatters. By the way, on my blog, I have a lot of articles that I cited on the business of evolution. If you take a look there, you'll find a lot of this critical stuff. Yeah.
So why could it have been, multiple things like the evolution of the animals, the DNA change, the bones changing, and also the lateral gene transfer? I'm not understanding why it has to be just one or the other.
No. I didn't say it has to be. I said if you believe in a tree of life, it has to be. I didn't say it has to be in nature. On the contrary, these things in nature are all correct. And since they're all correct, there isn't a tree. The idea of life forming a tree structure is incorrect.
But wouldn't it be forming the tree structure, but the things just transfer to the side? It's like, I feel like that's not true. But the branches are just interconnected. The
tree structure is supposed to give me a tree-like development of organisms. Where does a cat come from? A cat comes from this, and this thing comes from that, and that thing comes from that, and it comes by taking its genes and taking its genes down, right? And it's by descent. Genes are transferred only by descent. So then I can tell you the way in which this thing with its DNA developed from that thing with its DNA and that thing with its DNA. That gives you a line of the development of DNA back to the first replicator.
Right.
But that's only if this DNA developed from the DNA of its parent. And this DNA developed from the DNA of its parent.
The DNA mutates, that's the thing. Like it could completely
Sure, it developed from. It mutates. That means to say this parent had its DNA when it, we'll see when we go to Gottleib how it works. When the DNA replicates and the double helix unwinds, and you get two single branches, and then the cell splits, and each of the single branches attracts to it a companion branch to make the double helix. That's how it happens, right?
Right, but sometimes it misreads and creates an...
That's the point I'm making, and you haven't registered it. The point that I'm making is, you take the DNA of the parent, and then you have to get the zygotes, the gametes, and the zygote, right? When that happens, and there are mistakes made, it means the DNA of the parent is transferred to the child and to the offspring, and in that process, something happens. But what happens to it is there's a mistake or some kind of damage or some kind of change or maybe an improvement that takes place. But still, if I ask, where did this DNA come from? It came wholly from the parent. And then I can go from parent to parent to parent and have a branch of a tree. But if you tell me that some of the DNA didn't come from the parent at all, not correctly copied, not incorrectly copied, not intact, not broken, no, some other organism injected some of its DNA, then I don't have a branch. I have a bush. And I have this organism related to things on this branch, it's also related to things on this branch, so the two branches come together, they're not separate, you don't have a tree anymore.
But that normally happens from like the viruses, because viruses...
You don't know how it normally happens because it happens in a dozen ways so far, and tomorrow it'll be 2 dozen. There are many, many different ways in which lateral gene transfer takes place, and it's a subject of active, creative discovery, and new discoveries being made all the time. So would it be viruses? So what? The point is, you can't then describe the development of life with a tree. It's the wrong structure. You need something like a net, which has horizontal connections as well as vertical connections. The idea of doing it in a tree-like form is a mistake. That's all I'm trying to show. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I agree that these things did happen. I'm just pointing out the consequences for the so-called tree of life. Look up tree of life on Google, and you'll see all these objections there. I'm not making anything up. Yeah.
You had 4. Is that the ways in which organisms have changed, and we haven't done 5 yet, or have we completed the 5?
I'm trying to remember the 5th one now. There's a common descent, and there's change, and there's speciation, and there's I don't remember the 5th at the moment. I knew it before. Maybe it'll come to me. Yeah.
If all these objections are known, so why do you think they're still being taught?
Oh, I haven't begun to scratch the surface of the objections. I've just mentioned 1 or 2. I have a bunch here, and the bunch here is only a selection. But I'll tell you something. About 15 years ago, I gave this lecture here And I noticed the student sort of nodding his head and looking sort of bored. So when I finished, I called him up and I said, seems like you're familiar with this material. He said, yes. How did you become familiar with it? He said, I just graduated Dartmouth, and we had a full year course. He was a biology major. A full year course in evolution in the senior year. I said, really? At Dartmouth? And you learned these objections? He said, yeah. All the objections you mentioned we studied. I said, really? That's amazing. I'd never heard of any university teaching this stuff. So I said to him, at the end of the year, how many of the students believed that evolution was true? He said, a small minority. Because if you teach it fairly, then you won't believe it. They just don't teach it fairly. Okay, I'm not going to go into the whole the politics and the fascist fascist techniques they use to suppress dissent. But anyway, so it's a political thing. It's an ideological thing. Someone asked me about this. Maybe I'll talk about it at the end. I think there are certain ways to explain parts of it. I can't explain the whole thing, but parts of it. Anyway, so that's problems with the tree of life and the meanings of evolution. So let me run you through some of the standard objections that are made. And at the end, I want to read to you from Gelernter's article, the particular problem of proteins, which is a tiny, tiny area of evolution, maybe 1,000th of the whole story of evolution, and that alone, he claims, mathematically shows that it's impossible. So it's a good example of how certainly it could fall. There are certain types of logical mistakes which are characteristic of evolutionary support. And some of them I call misuse of data. You've all heard that bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. That's proven in hospitals where after a while the antibiotics don't work anymore, right? So let's just think. Evolution means change in the DNA. And a change which now makes the bacterium immune to the antibiotic. How do you know that's what happened? Well, look, the antibiotic used to kill him, and now it doesn't kill him. Okay. But couldn't there be another explanation without changes in DNA? Here's a thought. Maybe the original population of bacteria weren't all identical, exactly identical. Maybe there were variations. Every species we know of anything else has variations in it. And maybe of all the bacteria causing a certain disease in the universe, 98% are susceptible to the antibiotic and 2% not. There are 2% naturally that are not. Okay, you apply the antibiotic. If you kill off 90% of the bacteria in the body, don't forget the body's also fighting the infection. Bodies don't die automatically of infections. Just with antibiotics, you get cured much faster. And the body's fighting, and the body will kill off the 2%, and you'll in fact be cured. But if you do that long enough, then the 2% that are naturally immune are going to occupy more and more of the space because you're selectively killing off large numbers of the ones who aren't immune, and that leaves open space for the ones that are immune to multiply and fill more and more of the space. Maybe it's only selection of prior immunity that's causing the immunity of the antibiotics, of the bacteria. Do you know that not to be the case? You don't know that to be not to be the case. You didn't test it. You didn't find the DNA of the ones who were dying, and find the other and showed that there wasn't that DNA before. You didn't find the mutation and date it. So what are you doing? You're taking the development of resistance to antibiotics and saying that's proof of evolution because that's what you want to say, because that's what you want to support, without even considering an alternative hypothesis. Same with insects that become immune to certain insecticides. No one has charted where the breakdown is. You know what's required to that there is a breakdown? If you do it with a bacterium, here's what you do. You take a single bacterium, single one, and put it in a medium and let it multiply. If you let it multiply over time, by tomorrow morning you have 10,000, and by the million, and in the afternoon you have 1,000,000, right? You have lots and lots and lots of them. Then apply the antibiotic to this family of bacteria and see that the antibiotic kills half. Then you know that something has happened. Because the original one, presumably, either would have been killed or wouldn't have been killed. And now you got a giant population, some of which are killed and some of which aren't. So something must have changed. That would be an experiment that indicates that some of the DNA has changed, and that would be a reason to think that that's what conferred the immunity. But that isn't done. It's just, you see that it's getting harder and harder to kill them, so it must be evolution. Well, that's wrong logic. I'm not saying the result is wrong, I'm saying the logic is wrong. The story that's told is that you see tiny differences in the nature, what's called the phenome of the creature, its physical presence, physical development, on the basis of changes in DNA. Let's say we could trace that. And over time, you just accumulate a lot of small differences. And then, by accumulating a lot of small differences, you get a large difference. Well, one of the greatest defenders of evolution in history, Stephen Jay Gould, who was a professor at Harvard, he wrote The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, 1,400 pages long. And unlike the biology students that we have here, I read it, among other things. And he writes that the processes that change, let's say, the shape of a dog's tail, or the thickness of a sheep's wool, or the length of the horn of a deer, or something else like that, those processes that make minor changes within species are not the same processes that make changes from species to species. It's a different causal process. So it isn't an accumulation of just small effects. It's a different type of causal process that results in that. Now, Stephen Jay Gould isn't everybody, and not everybody agrees with him, but he's a big gun. And he's not a closet creationist. So you can't just simply say we know that the small changes accumulate into big changes, because some big people say, no, it doesn't happen that way. They have to show that you're right and he's wrong. Try it. Read all 1,400 pages and give it a chance. And then I want to share with you in detail a famous case, the black and white moths in Europe and in North America.
Wait, what was the guy's name?
It's a story about, I'm going to read it in detail from a review. I'll explain it. The rough story is there's a certain type of moth that has two forms, a light-colored and a dark-colored, and the proportion of how many are light-colored and dark-colored changed over time, and you can see why, because circumstances which reveal the moths to the birds that eat them changed. Trees changed their color, and since they changed their color, the one type of moth became more visible on the tree, and the other type of moth became less visible on the tree, and the ones that became more visible on the tree went down in number, and the ones that weren't visible went up in number. So you can see the birds are eating more of them, and that shows you how evolutionary pressures can have an effect on a population. Okay, that's the story. Now, aside from the fact I'm going to show you there are at least 5 lies in the story, but aside from that, let's just think. What's the story about? There's some type of moth. It has light and dark colored individuals. At the beginning of the story, there are light and dark ones. In the middle of the story, there are light and dark ones. At the end of the story, there are light and dark ones. Only the percentages change. The percentages change. When there's pressure, these get killed more, and those get killed less, so they can become more of these and less of those, and so forth and so on. This is supposed to be a showcase of evolution at work. Now, let's go back 12 and a half minutes. What was the name of Darwin's book? Origin of Species. Does this story reveal to you the origin of a species? It doesn't even reveal the origin of a character, of a feature, of a color, nothing. All the features stayed exactly the same from beginning to end. Really? This is a showcase example of evolution? Excuse me. At the most, this shows that if you put yourself in danger, then you get killed more often. Did anybody deny that? Did any critic of evolution ever deny that if the circumstances change and you're more vulnerable to predators, there are going to be less of you? No one ever denied that. How could anyone think that this is an example of showing that evolution is true? It's totally irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. The critic I'm going to quote in a moment doesn't make that point because he's not trained in logic. He's trained in evolution. Now, an account of this story was written by Jerry Coyne. For those of you who don't know, by the way, he spells his last name C-O-Y-N-E. That's to disguise the fact that he's a Cohen. He's a Jew and he's a Cohen. He's at the University of Chicago, a very famous, vocal, vociferous, active, aggressive proponent of evolution. But this time, this was in the 1990s, he wrote a critical review of this idea for Nature. Nature is one of the two biggest science magazines in the world. That's the British one. The American one's called Science, which of course is just a little better than Nature. I'm an American talking. Okay, listen to the account that Jerry Coyne wrote. I think he must have done penance for this. That's why he became such a vociferous. From time to time, evolutionists re-examine a classic experimental study and find, to their horror, that it is flawed or downright wrong. We no longer use, and he gives a list of a few of them, which have been used to support evolution, and we abandoned them because we discovered that they're not right. Until now, however, the prize horse in our stable of examples has been the evolution of industrial melanism, that is to say, the melanism is the dark form of the color, in the peppered moth, Bistone beetularia. This classic example is in bad shape. First of all, this moth probably does not rest on tree trunks. Wow. Wow, the whole story was the color of the tree changed, and therefore the moths resting on the trees are more visible, and the birds eat more of them. But the moths don't land on tree trunks. Period. End of story. Nobody checked that. Nobody checked that. Could you imagine? Or somebody made it up. Exactly 2 moths have been seen in such a position in more than 40 years of extensive search. Nobody noticed that when they told the story? No, nobody noticed it. This alone invalidates the whole experiments, because how did the guy who thought this up do it? He put the moths on the trees and waited for them to be eaten. Wasn't that convenient of him? He put them on the trees. That's not how it's in nature. You don't have little elves running around putting them on trees. Either they land there or they don't, and they don't. Okay, that's one problem. Furthermore, this guy, Kettlewell, who did the experiment, he put them on the trees in the daytime. In the daytime, these moths don't rest at all. They're flying the whole time. They rest at night when they're not visible to the birds. Hey? Okay, that's another thing. The story is further eroded by noting that the resurgence of Typica occurred well before the recolony of political trees. Okay, so the story goes like this. You have these light and dark moths. The trees are invaded by what do you call the growths on trees that I can't remember that. Lichens. Invaded by lichens that change the color of the trees. And then the ones that now are more visible on the tree are eaten more by the birds, and they go down in number. Then the lichens died out, and then the ones that went down in number went back up in number. That's the story. But if you check when the lichens died out, and you check when the ones that went down went back up, it's not the same time. Indeed, the ones that went down went back up before the lichens died out. So, I guess it isn't the color of the tree that's doing the job. Hey? Furthermore, the same up and down of the different types happened in the United States, where there was no change in the color of the trees. The ones that went down in Europe went down in America with no change in the color of the trees. Finally, later studies tried to replicate the results that Kepler reported, and no one was able to replicate it. Now, Coyne's reviewing a book. He says the book finds many other flaws in the work. Many other flaws. My God, how many flaws do you need? How many flaws could you find? How bad could it be? This was in all the textbooks. All the textbooks. And it remained in all the textbooks after his review came out. I don't know if it's still in the textbooks. This was 20 years ago. But this is a science? These are your critical, independently thinking scientists who check their hypotheses and check their data and so forth and so on. What's going on here? Find me this in physics. Find me this in chemistry. Find me this in molecular biology. Something very strange is going on here. Intermediary forms, that's a gigantic disaster, and it's a gigantic debate, and you can find people who lie about it on across the board. No, it isn't. They're all there, and it's not as long, and you didn't do it with at night or on Tuesdays. They have all sorts of excuses. But the people, by the way, the place to go for this is Discovery Institute in Seattle, where they have a lot. Some of the stuff there I don't agree with, but particularly some of the philosophical stuff. But they have many papers linked to all the outside literature, which show the Cambrian explosion, for example. The missing links in the fossil record are legion. Now, just read to you what Stephen Stanley, who was a professor at Hopkins, wrote about this. Myriads of species have inhabited the earth for millions of years without evolving noticeably. You go down in your excavations, and you come across the bones and all right, and then you go down another layer, another layer, another layer, million years, another million years. They're all the same. They're all the same. The fossil record offered convincing evidence for evolution, but not for the prevalence of gradual evolution. Because what you find is you come across a certain species, and you go down a few million years, and it's all the same. And then before that, you find something considerably different. You don't find gradual transitions. There must have been transitions. These are older and these are younger. Something changed, but Darwin requires gradual transitions. Now you'll ask me, why does Darwin require gradual transitions? I'll tell you why. Let's go back to the beginning of the story. You have a thing that makes copies of itself. That thing is very complicated. Suppose you make a big change, which would reorganize it in a fundamental way. What's the likelihood that it will survive? Basically zero. Because you've got to preserve its ability to operate in the face of the change. I'll give you one example. This has been studied with respect to the giraffe. Going after the higher leaves on the tree, which is wrong because they spend 50% of their time eating with their necks bent. And they travel widely to get. So that's just a long story altogether. But okay, so now the neck grows bigger. Aha! And the head is higher up. That's how you can eat the higher trees. Eat the leaves of the higher trees, right? But now the heart has to pump blood higher up to the head. Should the heart change also? Be stronger to pump? And the blood vessels also change? Okay. But now the organs of balance for the creature are in its head. If the head is further distant from the feet, and the difference between a deer's neck and a giraffe's neck is quite considerable, isn't it? Then it's, when it goes up to eat the trees, it's going to topple over because it can't stand straight. So you got to change the heart and the vertebrae and the neck and the balance organs all at the same time. But worse than that, when you pump the blood up to the brain, Gravity's pulling it down. So what the giraffe has is like levers in the. So when you pump up, there's a lever that holds it, and then you pump up again, there's a lever that holds it. You don't have that. Horses don't have that. Only giraffes have that. How many different things have to work at the same time? Now you make random changes. These are all coordinated. Make 5 random changes in a complicated organism. It's going to die. It's going to die. So the probability of getting large-scale random changes that don't assassinate the organism are very small, and Darwin knew this. And therefore Darwin said there have to be very small changes, and the fossil record should show the small changes. And he said in his book, Darwin in a certain sense was very honest. He raised objections to his own theory in an honest way. He did make mistakes, but he was honest in his character. He said, anyone who trusts the fossil record in 1869 should reject my theory, because the fossil record doesn't support it. Because there are too many missing links. But he said, I think that we haven't searched enough. We're primitive in searching the fossil record. And also, I think that certain types of organisms aren't preserved well it's going to be inherently missing. So therefore, although the fossil record is against me, still I think my theory is right. Now, Stanley criticizes him here for circular logic. You're saying a theory is right. You're going to the evidence. You're saying that so the evidence supports you. Well, this evidence is against you. You say, well, since I believe my theory is right, I think the evidence is missing, and it's really there. That's not how you argue that you're right. That's how you preserve yourself from an objection that you're wrong. But when you say the evidence is there when you haven't found it, I don't have to believe you. You don't have to believe yourself. You're hoping it's there. You're only hoping it's there because you believe your theory. But your theory was up for grabs. You were trying to convince me to believe your theory. You can't use your theory to support your theory. That's circular logic. Okay, that was 1869. But in 1969, 100 years later, when a gigantically larger sample of the fossils had been uncovered, and when it had been shown that many, many forms that they thought wouldn't be fossilized really are, even down to single cells can be fossilized. So then they felt that the missing links were simply absolutely impossible to ignore. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge of the Museum of Natural History in New York wrote a famous paper together called Punctuated Equilibria. You can Google it and look it up. And they concocted a theory to explain this. Now, it went through variations later, but the basic original theory was this. Of course, there have to be intermediary forms, no question about it. But where would they be? Where would you expect to find intermediary forms? If you have a large, coordinated population, 50 million wildebeest on the plains of Central Africa, because the population is so large, it's going to be stable. Changes are not going to spread through that large population. So when you go down, like Stanley said, and you see this creature, and a million years later the same, and a million years later the same, and a million years later the same, that's because you're digging into the vast piece of geography that the 50 million occupied. That's probably what you're going to find by random, right? The vast place where the big population. But circumstances can create small, isolated populations. Here's a scenario. There's a thunderstorm, lightning, and this wildebeest scatter in all directions, frightened to death, and 500 of them run over a pass between two mountains, a ridge between two mountains, to a valley. 3 days later, the story clears. They're in the valley. They don't remember how they got there, and they have no clue how to get back. And it's a small valley. Now you got 500 there, and they are stuck in that valley. With 500, you could have rapid changes. Rapid. Instead of millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. Not time to go down to the store and get milk, but let's say hundreds of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years in the layers of evolution, not going to leave a very, very detailed record. And when you dig down to find bones, what's the chances you're going to hit on that valley? Next to nothing, because it's a very small geographical piece. That's where the changes take place. Hidden from the eye, that's where they take place. And there really are small changes, and that's why Darwin's theory works. That was the explanation of punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium means things stay the same and then there's a punctuation with a big change, but that's what you see. The Darwinian evolution is taking place in the valley where you don't see it. Because when you dig for the bones, you're not going to dig there. Some people pointed out that the logic here has a peculiar structure. Let's see, I have a theory, I'm looking for evidence. The evidence is missing. Somebody comes along and says, I know you didn't find it, and I can tell you why you didn't find it. Because the evidence is hidden away in a place where you're not going to find it. So am I supposed to now say, oh, so now the theory's good? Why should I say that? You didn't show me the evidence. You just explained why I won't find the evidence if the theory's true. But I'm trying to decide whether to agree that the theory's true. I can't decide to agree the theory's true on pretending that the evidence is where I can't find it. George committed the murder. Where's the murder weapon? George is very good at hiding things. That's why he didn't find it. Well, where are his fingerprints? George wears gloves. He knows how to do that. That's why he didn't find his fingerprints. Where's the motive? George hired a psychologist so he can portray himself as not having a motive. Where's the weapon? George had a dissolving weapon and it dissolved into dust. So he's guilty. Really? Really? You didn't find the evidence. All you say is, if he's guilty, I can explain why there's no evidence. That shouldn't convince you that he's really guilty, should it? So this explanation is very peculiar. If it's supposed to lead me to conclude, oh, everything's fine now. Now I see why I should accept evolution. The logic here is, somewhat questionable. Now, Gould understood this. In his magisterial structure of evolutionary theory, he writes about this. And he says, we ought to be able to show, in terms of genetic connections, that some changes took place where we didn't see. There's indirect evidence that this kind of thing happened. He understands that you can't just tell this story and base a positive case for evolution on it, but the positive evidence has not been produced. So here's again a case of reasoning which isn't appropriate reasoning. Just as, oh boy, I didn't realize it got so late. As Stanley pointed out, that he said the fossil record will be filled in because he assumed his theory is true and he said it will be filled in. Well, these are examples of weak reasoning. I'm a logician. I'm very suspicious of a discipline in which there are many examples of weak reasoning which all come to the same conclusion, that we're right. That bespeaks of prejudice. If they're just poor reasoning, you should expect them to also have some weakly reasoned objections. None of those appear. No objections appear at all. So I think that this should make you cautious. Made me cautious. Tomorrow, Mr. Hashem, I'll talk to you about Gelernter's particular example for the existence of proteins, the development of proteins.